Be creative, innovative, passionate. Be excellent, inspiring, driven. Be faithful, disciplined, prepared. At Union University, you will thrive in a Christ-centered community and be equipped for success in your life and career. Begin your journey today. At Union University, be transformed.
Students of the world, gather round. It's time for the World Student Podcast with our host, Mark and Darren.
And welcome once again to the World Student Podcast. I'm your host, Darren Sutherland, but I'm not the brains behind it. Mark, how are you today, my friend?
Very good. Greetings from Chicago. I'm still blown away by that show we had last week, Darren, with the students from all over the U.S. That was a great show. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
You know, the past couple of weeks, we've been in Seattle, we've been in St. Louis, New Orleans, Union, Jackson, Tennessee, New Jersey. And you, Mark, you've called in to do the show from New Orleans, of course. You've called in from Chicago, from your home base in New Jersey. You know, if this global pandemic hadn't have struck us, where else would you have called in more than likely from?
Well, I would have definitely been in India, Vietnam, London for sure. But I'm still grounded, Darren. I was looking at flights yesterday to Vietnam, and it's not easy to get to these places right now. You have to quarantine for 2 weeks if they'll even let you in. I mean, we used to have, if you had an American passport, you could pretty much go anywhere, anytime. Now having an American passport allows you to go almost nowhere, anytime.
Well, it'll get fixed before long. I tell folks, and this is not a political show, but I said this thing will either be over or expanded on November 3rd, and we'll leave it at that. Hey, want to thank our sponsor, Union University. Union is a highly ranked college year after year. It's one of the nation's top Christian universities. Learn, thrive, succeed. Begin your journey today, uu.edu. Real quick, before we get with our guest, Mark, we're going to touch on this. We'll cover this at a later date. Big news out of the technology world yesterday that Google may get involved in higher education. Mark, what's your first synopsis or your first thought of that?
Well, I don't think this is that new. I mean, we have a lot of companies that have ventured down this path with certificates and training programs and whatnot, circumventing some of what universities have been trying to do, and I would say trying to do not very successfully. So Google, Amazon has a program, even Starbucks has ventured into this space. They're taking education and skill development right directly to the public. So this is going to continue to change how higher education is viewed and how students consume education. As I said to you in an email yesterday, Darren, I think that once society makes the switch that universities and the credentials they provide are no longer valuable, other entities, including places like Google, are going to be in the forefront of this, and people will just bypass universities and go directly to corporate and get what they need and avoid what they don't need. So here we go.
Well, and you know the next thing that's going to happen, don't you?
Tell me.
Elon Musk is going to invent something we can put on the side of our head where we don't even have to go to college, and all the knowledge will just be pumped into our brain. So we won't even need it. We'll be surgeons just by buying the chip. That's what Elon will do. I'm just kidding. But anyway,
I'll tell you, every time I watch people at the United Nations, they have those little translators on. Is that the word, translator? Yeah, translator. Anyway, I'd love to have some kind of patch so that when you went to any country in the world, you automatically could understand their language and speak it. I guess that's the lazy man's way of learning languages and culture, but boy, that would be a gift.
Hey, there's always something. Hey, let's take a break. Let's hear a commercial from our friends at Union University. We'll be right back with our guest on the World Student Podcast.
Be creative, innovative, passionate. Be excellent, inspiring, driven. Be faithful, disciplined, prepared. At Union University, you will thrive in a Christ-centered community and be equipped for success in your life and career. Begin your journey today. At Union University, be transformed.
And welcome back to the World Student Podcast. Darren Sutherland, Mark Kopinski with Global Student Outreach, my partner. Mark, I'm going to go ahead and let you bring on our guest. Tell us about him and let him introduce himself.
Well, this is going to be a great show. We've got a heavyweight in the industry on all sides of what we've been talking about over the last few months on these podcasts. Mr. Gary Bergman is with us today. Gary has spent many decades in college admissions at the highest levels, senior administrative positions. And then he switched over, some say to the dark side. I'll let Gary talk more about that. But he now owns a company in Long Island, New York, that works with hundreds of universities and hundreds of educational agents, people we've had on this show before, to match students to particular institutions and get them enrolled. So without any more ado, I'll let Gary introduce himself, talk a little bit about his company, and then we'll get into it with him, okay? Gary, welcome.
Well, welcome, and thank you for the opportunity. We here based in New York. Our company name is University Study, Inc. We are now in our 12th year, so we are one of the few U.S.-based agencies working to help international students. We work with a large number of U.S. universities, a little over 200, and basically we're pretty much, I guess you could say, in the middle. We interact with agencies all around the world who have interested and qualified students who want to come to the U.S., but they're not exactly sure how to process applications and how to get those important I-20s and then visas. And then we work with those applicants with the U.S. universities. So we spend a lot of time with this. In a normal year, we probably process close to 5,000 applications.
So Gary, take us back. I mean, I know you were in the Midwest in college admissions, and then you went out east and maybe back again. Give our listeners kind of an overview of your early years and then how you transitioned into this, because this journey, we have a lot of college administrators that listen to the show. And I think especially right now with the pandemic going on, they're scratching their heads thinking, what's my career path going to look like? Maybe talk us through a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, well, like a lot of university administrators, I started at the bottom. I was a basic everyday admissions counselor. I traveled all over the Midwest and other parts of the U.S., visiting high schools, community colleges, talking with students about enrollments at universities. And it was just a great experience. After several years of that, I moved up and I became a director of admissions at a university in the Chicago area and learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes, but grew and learned. Later, I moved on and I became an associate provost of enrollment services. I was at one university in the Midwest for 10 years, and it was mainly work with domestic students, trying to build enrollments, trying to keep students enrolled. Very rewarding, but very difficult. From there, I moved on to 2 or 3 other universities in the same capacity. And I finished, I guess it was 2009. I worked for 13 years at Long Island University, heading up their enrollment management, admissions, financial aid, registrar, bursar. And during that span, I signed a lot of agreements with international agencies. And 15, 18 years ago, very few universities were doing that. A lot of skepticism about agencies and their credibility. But we developed a lot of good relationships with these agents. And about 2008, I decided that there was a need for someone to be U.S.-based who could really support agencies and represent them with U.S. universities. So in that year, we started University Study, Inc., and it's been just a great roller coaster ride ever since.
So, Gary, help us demystify this, because we've had university folks on that are in charge of recruiting students, primarily international students, and then we've had what I would call education counselors on from abroad that identify students that are interested in coming to the U.S. and help them, and then of course more traditional agencies like you're talking about now. How does this all work? I mean, Union University is one of our sponsors, and I've been talking to their folks a little bit about developing some relationships with agencies. How would Union go about finding an agent in a particular country that might have success identifying students and sending them to Tennessee? I mean, walk us through that whole process and how you get in the middle of it, so to speak, between the university and the agency.
Yeah, good question. Well, universities have a lot of resources available to them. And I guess the issue has been traditionally, U.S. universities have only focused on U.S. domestic students. But as enrollment patterns changed, they began to look more to recruit out of their state, out of their region, and then lastly, to start looking at the international market. So a university can go to an organization like the American International Recruitment Council. They're a certification body. They can get a lot of information about agencies and what countries they're recruiting students for. That would be, I think, an initial main source. Talking with other universities that are working with agents would be a second. And where we usually come in is a university who is not in a position to have a lot of resources to travel internationally. They may not have staff. They need a little assistance. So when we make a visit to a university, we usually sit down with senior administration. They may have a consultant that they're working with. We'll meet with that consultant and we'll basically tell them what we do and how we do it, which is to mostly identify what a good student looks like. So in this case, if Union would be interested in exploring possibilities, we would try to get an understanding of all their academic programs, their requirements, and really what a good student looks like in terms of their academic background and their academic interest in a particular major. And once we have that kind of an exchange, that could lead to an agreement. And later on, we would then provide them with applicants who meet all their criteria. And universities should always remember they have a lot to say about this process. All an agency can do is to present a good applicant. The university must decide to admit them, deny them, or possibly defer the application.
Gary, as we grow and the world changes and education becomes more universal, do these admissions counselors, they need to have a global perspective instead of a local perspective? Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely.
So, the first step, and we hear this, okay? Mark and I hear this all the time. We can't afford to go to India to recruit students. We can't go to Australia. We can't do this. We can't do that. What would be their first step in partnering with your company or one like it that would help them? And what would you guys basically cover for them and do for them?
Yeah, basically what we try to do is to establish a relationship. We don't want to be perceived as a vendor. We want to partner with the university and work closely with their staff. And that involves education. It involves awareness. We will do whatever we can to train university staff. And many of the university staff have other responsibilities. So we're there to supplement the work that they're doing. And that may involve Zoom training. It may involve a personal visit. It may mean meeting with their staff at some of the professional organizations. And once that relationship is started, and I like to look at it as we're an extension of the recruitment effort of the university. Once we have that relationship going, Our job is to identify those students in the countries where they are. And so we have developed these partnerships with other organizations around the world to try to match up those students. And using Union as an example again, we would do everything we could to attract students who would be interested in that Christian education and would have the academics that Union is looking for.
Nice. Mark, what you got?
Well, I'm curious. We haven't dug too deep into this, although it's come up a couple of times during these podcasts we've done. So, I'm just going to come straight at it. Gary, what's the big controversy in, university circles on working with third parties like this, like you, like agents around the world, getting paid for their services and their efforts to identify and help you enroll students? I mean, take us through this controversy, which we read about, from time to time, and sometimes a lot of times, especially when, we see all the other crazy stuff going on in colleges and universities, college sports, the advertising, all this other stuff. How has the college admissions process and the identifying and recruiting international students, how have they gotten caught up in this controversy? And what is, kind of sort this out for us. What are people complaining about, concerned about? And where are we now with this whole controversy?
Yeah, I think there's a number of issues there. A lot of this stems from a basic mistrust of working with a company who is not directly a part of the university. So that's a big part of this. A lot of people are concerned that maybe the applications they're going to get are kind of pushed to the university rather than the students self-selecting. So there's a lot of mistrust. That's changing a lot. The other thing, it's just foreign. I hate to use that word in this context, but it's an unusual situation for a university to pay a fee to help get students. You're not permitted by U.S. law to do that for a U.S. domestic student, but you are permitted to do that for an international student. So, I've always looked at this, it's no different in your home. If you have an electrical problem, you will bring an electrician and you will pay him a fee. If you have a plumbing situation, you're going to bring in a professional who can handle work that you cannot do readily yourself. Same thing with recruitment. If you need to attract students from other parts of the world, you most likely do not have the resources, the staff, or the time. So working with a company that is a specialist can provide great opportunities and rewards. It's just that controversy, Mark, that there's a lot of concerns, and that's changing. Each year, more and more universities are looking to companies that can help them with their enrollment objectives.
Gary, let me ask you this right here. We live in such a competitive world, okay? And we're talking about in colleges and universities now paying athletes to be on teams, letting them sign their own brand sponsorships, and that with the NCAA. And we could do a whole week of shows on that and never understand it totally, okay? But there's such handcuffs on these admission reps. Will we ever see a date, do you feel like, in the near future, in the future, where admission reps are paid on production, on how many kids that they sign, opposed to just being a salaried employee?
I think we're moving more in that direction. The challenge here is there are those handful of universities, those very high-ranked, large, research-based universities that no matter what happens in any market, in any economic situation, will always have more applications than they can possibly not only process, but enroll. But that leaves maybe another 80% of the universities in the U.S. who really are hurting, who need more students. So I think you're going to see that trend move more to compensation for those admissions counselors. A lot of people forget how hard those people work. I look back at my own history, Mark, and I'm sure many others are the same way. You are a slave to the institution. They have you work many hours, you work in evenings and weekends for minimal compensation in a lot of cases, and that's changing. So I do see that more and more universities will compensate based on performance.
Gary, where would you say the top 3 or 4 top countries to recruit from right now are for U.S. students, even with the pandemic in effect?
Yeah, I think the numbers pretty much stay the same. You've got pretty much China and India right behind them. Those would be 1, 2. Vietnam is obviously a major player, particularly with undergraduate students. I'd say those top 3. There are all kinds of others we can put in the mix, but I would say that China, India, Vietnam.
What's a sleeper? Give us a sleeper, somebody that you think is going to grow in the next 5 to 10 years that people maybe they don't have it on their radar, but they need to start.
Yeah, I think maybe getting back to the Middle East, if things would change with SOCOM in Saudi Arabia, I think that potentially could come back some. You've got some other countries. Mongolia is producing more and more students. Taiwan, Korea. It's a little difficult right now to predict who the next big player may be.
Gotcha.
But those are the numbers I'm looking at.
Gotcha. Mark, that's the first time we've heard Mongolia. Have you ever been to Mongolia, Mark?
I was going to say I have been in my former life when I was in the UK. We used to recruit there every year. I'm laughing. We should do a show from Mongolia sometime, Darren. How do you think we'd do there?
You know, the only thing I've ever heard out of Mongolia is there was a wrestler back in the WWE back in the day called the Mongolian Stomper, okay? So you guys will have to educate me on Mongolia. What you got, Mark?
Well, I'm just curious. I mean, we've been talking a lot about the pandemic, and I'd be interested in getting your views, Gary, on what this has done to your business. What has the flow of students look like? We're now a few weeks into the traditional fall semester in the U.S. Have any of your students actually made it to the U.S.? If they haven't, what are they doing? Are they studying online? Are they sitting at home waiting? What's the situation right now?
Yeah, prior to the pandemic, we were going to have a record year. Our applications were way up in almost every country. But with the pandemic, the students, cannot get visas because of all the embassies being closed. You talked earlier about restrictions with travel, airlines. So our business in terms of enrollment on campus coming to the U.S. is down probably 70 to 80%. We do have a fairly large number of students who have registered this fall 2020 online. We're just waiting now to get past that 2-week drop ad period to see how many of them stay there. But the word we're getting is a lot of the students internationally are not that interested in online. They want the U.S. experience. So a number of them are just staying home or working. As we talked, a few are doing online. A number have opted to go to other countries. So, it's just puzzling to see where we're going to end up with this fall. I know we're starting to get more interest in spring 2021 and fall 21, but the pandemic has just caused major issues, and almost every university we work with is reporting significant decreased numbers, particularly on campus.
So what's the longer term answer to this? I mean, how long do you think it's going to take to recover? And what would, perhaps the recovery look like? I mean, Darren alluded to the election coming up, and, it sounds like we might have a vaccine by the end of the year, this, that, and the other thing. But it feels like China is no longer going to be the go-to place for students, or, at least that's where it's trending right now. I guess I'm asking you to look into your crystal ball and tell us what 2022, 2023 looks like, especially for institutions that are not at the top of the heap. I mean, I I think the NYUs, the Northeasterns, the Harvards, they're going to get their students probably, like you said earlier, no matter what. But what about the smaller, less known schools? Take us through that.
Yeah, I think our projections here for those smaller schools, a little less known, they're going to see some really difficult times in 2021. They may see a slight uptick for spring 2021, but that die is already cast. Looking at fall 2021, I think it'll be a little stronger. But as you indicated, that the political scene and what happens with the next U.S. election is going to be very telling. And then with the virus vaccine, if that comes, we're projecting the 2022 and 2023 year, we'll see some big improvements. We're not sure it'll get back to pre-2019 levels for at least another 3 years.
Gary, and go ahead, Mark. I'm
well,
sorry.
Darren, I was just going to say, this is probably another show, but you look at regional institutions, whether they're private schools or government schools, and you look at the current situation. I mean, we already had before this pandemic some serious issues for these schools. Declining high school seniors. The population is just shrinking in that area, so less students to recruit. Then a lot of these schools have been very dependent on athletics, as you've mentioned many times. They've got 115, 120 kids out for football and this and that. The pandemic has wiped out almost all of that. We have almost no sports this fall. The population locally is shrinking, and now the international piece is gone. So, the survival of these institutions is really in question, isn't it? I mean, everywhere you look, they're handcuffed by, their principal need for revenue, which is students coming to campus.
Yeah, it's a real concern. I honestly don't see how a lot of these universities long-term can survive the way they've been going. Their fixed costs with faculty, institutional resources and needs. It's not just the international, the domestic side is way down. The lower cost tuition for a lot of these online programs, it's just not enough. And too many universities are now dipping into endowments and enhancing their fundraising efforts. It's just going to be challenging. And there's going to be X number of universities, smaller, more isolated, that are not going to get through.
Gary, don't bring the big guys into this mix, the Harvards, the Boston colleges, the New York universities, or the major state universities like Ohio State or the University of Georgia. But for our small to mid-sized colleges around the country, and without disclosing inside information from any of your personal clients, in life we look at someone who sets an example and sets the bar for international recruitment. Who should some of these admissions counselors or admissions groups look at and say, wow, this is how college X did it. This is how college university did it. This is how this university did it, excuse me. Who would be some of those in the forefront that other schools need to look at? And we're talking pre-pandemic.
Are you looking for names of institutions that they could?
Yeah. They could just look at and say, wow. I mean, that information's all public unless it's a private school anyway. But I'd love to hear some examples of folks they need to talk to.
All right. Well, one smaller institution in Ohio, Ohio Dominican. Well, I'll tell you what, these guys are really working hard. They're very proactive. They happen to be a partner with us, and they work with some other agencies, but they're right on top of this. They're very speedy with their application review. That has a lot to do with it. They work with students, nonstop to assist them throughout the process. That would be one I would think of. University of Colorado at Denver. While it's a good size institution, they have staff that are committed to working with international and building their enrollments. There's a lot of other examples. Stevens Institute of Technology, a really good university. They happen to be in the top 100, but they're doing all kinds of webcasts. They do outreach to students. They travel on a limited basis. But those are institutions. If I were a university, I would be calling them and see if I could get some information. Keep in mind, not all the universities are forthcoming and want to give all their secrets out.
That's it.
Hey, Darren, I have a couple to add in two different directions. One would be for American and other students going out, leaving the U.S., because we've had some shows on study abroad and whatnot. And that's a small college outside of Baltimore called Goucher College. A lot of people probably haven't heard of it. But this institution requires with an R, every one of their undergraduate students to have an international experience. So that when you look at the ranking, they're always on top because 100% of their enrolled students go somewhere, whether that's to Europe or, to Mongolia or, goodness gracious, all kinds of places. So I think Goucher is one place to definitely look at. They've got a guy there by the name of Lu Chin Lee, who heads up their international operation. And we should have Lu Chin on the show sometime. I think they have a great philosophy. And on the other side, a small institution in New Jersey, not far from me, Drew University, who I know Gary works with. These guys went 10, 12 years ago from about 4% international to 17, 18% of their undergraduate enrollment now being from outside the United States. And I think they're in the top 15 or 20 in the country in terms of international enrollments. And they've done it, with working with people like Gary, working with outside companies, hiring people internally that can promote the institution. But they're a great model, very small, couple thousand students. But they're getting it done. So those are two more that I would submit.
Nice. Gary, before we have to get out of here because we're getting close to that time clock, what are these students looking for that's coming from international? What majors are they looking for, and what are they looking to study when they get to the States primarily?
Sure. It's varied. A lot of the graduate students are still looking for STEM programs, things in engineering, data analytics, business, computer science. On the undergraduate, it's pretty varied. Students from like Western Europe are still very interested in liberal arts type programs, biology, chemistry, physics. Business is always way up there. Again, computer science, information technology. Those would be some of the leaders that come to my mind.
Nice. Mark?
Well, just on the other side of that, Gary, what are these kids doing? I know you've been at this a long time, and a lot of these students have become lifelong friends of yours. What are they doing after they leave U.S. universities? Are they going back and inserting themselves in, corporate London or corporate Paris, or are they staying here and obtaining jobs and, ultimately, living here? What's the trajectory once they leave school?
Well, again, it's varied. Many of them come here with the expectation they'd like to stay in the U.S. as long as they can. So that's why there's a lot of support for the OPT, CPT programs where they can get some good hands-on practical experience in the U.S. A number of them really hope, although opportunities are declining rapidly, for H-1B visas to stay here more permanently and be sponsored. Those that don't have those options will go back to their homes, and that U.S. degree carries a lot of weight. So they go into business, they go into industry, they go into healthcare, they go into many different kinds of programs. And then some will go home and may come back at a later date to get an advanced degree in the U.S.
Nice. Gary, before we get out of here, tell folks again how they can get a hold of you, and you can help them out. I know you help colleges all across the country. We've already mentioned that, over 100. And tell folks how they can get a hold of you and anything else you want to leave them with.
Yeah, one of the best ways, they can go to our website, which is www.universitystudy.com. That's our public website. There's a place on there where they could express an inventory. They can call us here in New York. Our number is area code 631-427-8989. They can send me an email, gbergman@universitystudy.com. We'll be more than happy to help them any way we can.
Mark, thank you for bringing another tremendous guest on. And hey, Gary, I got one question to close out. Okay, this isn't something, but you know what? Me being the guy from the Southeast, I can ask the guy from Long Island this, and you probably hadn't put as much study on this as I have, although we're both in the college world. Okay. Will we finish the college football season this year, Gary? That's the question everyone in the Southeast wants to know.
Well, I don't want to say go Tide because that may get me in trouble.
Yes, it will. Go Dogs.
Yeah, I really don't know. I hope so. We enjoy the conference football a great deal. Let's hope everything works out well.
That's it. Mark, we appreciate it again, my friend, and thank you again for being a part of World Student Podcast, brought to you by our friends at Union University. And hey, folks, if your college or university wants to be a proud sponsor of World Student Podcast and have opportunities to reach kids all across the country, make sure you contact us here at World Student Podcast. We can help you out. Isn't that right, Mark?
That's it. We're here.
Tell them how to get a hold of you, Mark, for your services, and we'll get out of here, my friend.
Well, it's gsra.org.uk. That's the website. And at Kopensky33 is the Twitter handle where you can find me tweeting all day long. So I'm getting up there. I'm competing with our president now on tweeting.
There you go. There you go. Man, no matter how hard we try, we can't keep politics out of anything, can we, anymore? It's just society as a whole. So anyway, all right, guys, we'll talk to you later. Thanks once again for listening to the World Student Podcast, brought to you by Union University.
Thank you for listening to the World Student Podcast. For more information on how you can be a part of this podcast and information on international student recruitment, email us at worldstudentpodcast@gmail.com. And please leave a remark in the remarks section. This podcast was a production of BG Podcast Network. Jonathan Giles, producer. Jacob Sutherland, director.
Be creative, innovative, passionate. Be excellent, inspiring, driven. Be faithful, disciplined, prepared. At Union University, you will thrive in a Christ-centered community and be equipped for success in your life and career. Begin your journey today. At Union University, be transformed.
Fast Track Student Loans can get your student loans out of default, stop any wage garnishments, stop collection calls, and stop seizure of your tax refund. Give yourself a break. Stop the stress and get your student loan payments down to as little as $25 a month, based on what you can afford to pay. 800-292-6156. 800-292-6156. 800-292-6156. 800-292-6156.